The principal asked why I didn't report the bullying earlier. The bully's father laughed, "Because my son runs this school." The office went quiet. Then the principal did something nobody expected. I was sitting in Principal Dr. Evelyn Chambers' office at Riverside High School at 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in late October, my ribs still aching from where Kyle Thornton had shoved me into a locker that morning. My mother sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tight my fingers had gone numb. Across from us sat Kyle and his father, Richard Thornton, CEO of Thornton Industries, the largest employer in our small Ohio town. Richard was a big man, 6'3" with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than my mom's monthly salary as a dental hygienist. Dr. Chambers had asked me a simple question. Why hadn't I reported the bullying when it first started 9 months ago? Before I could answer, Richard Thornton had leaned back in his chair, loosened his tie, and delivered that line with a smile that made my stomach turn. The office had gone absolutely silent. I could hear the wall clock ticking, could hear someone's phone buzzing in the outer office, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mother's grip on my hand tightened even more. Dr. Chambers, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, had been principal at Riverside for 12 years. She set down her pen with deliberate care and looked at Richard Thornton with an expression I'd never seen on an educator's face before. I'd been a junior at Riverside High School for exactly 3 months when Kyle Thornton first targeted me. It was January, cold and gray, and I'd just transferred from St. Augustine's Catholic school after my parents' divorce left my mom unable to afford the tuition anymore. The transition had been rough, going from a small private school where I'd known everyone since kindergarten to a public school with 1,200 students where I knew exactly nobody. I was 17, skinny for my age at 5'9" and maybe 140 pounds, with glasses and a tendency to actually care about my grades. In other words, I was perfect bully bait. Kyle was everything I wasn't. 6'1", athletic, quarterback of the football team, with the kind of confidence that came from growing up rich in a town where your father employed a quarter of the population. He had thick dark hair, a jawline that belonged in a cologne ad, and a smile that could charm teachers and intimidate students in equal measure. The first time he noticed me was in American history class when I'd corrected the teacher, Mr. Whitfield, about a date related to the Battle of Gettysburg. Kyle had been sitting 2 rows behind me, and I'd heard him mutter, "Fucking nerd," loud enough for people around him to laugh, but quiet enough that the teacher hadn't caught it. The real harassment had started small, as these things always do. Books knocked out of my hands in the hallway, shoulders checking me when we passed. Comments about my clothes, my glasses, my dead-end future in this shithole town, as Kyle liked to call it. I'd told myself it was nothing, that it would blow over, that drawing attention to it would only make things worse. That was my first mistake. By March, it had escalated to deliberate trips in the cafeteria that sent my lunch tray crashing to the floor while the football table erupted in laughter. To finding my locker defaced with Sharpie, words like faggot and pussy scrawled across the metal in Kyle's distinctive handwriting that no teacher ever seemed to recognize. To gym class becoming a nightmare where basketballs would accidentally hit me in the face hard enough to give me a nosebleed. I'd started taking different routes through the school, timing my movements to avoid Kyle and his crew, eating lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria. My mom had noticed I was coming home with unexplained bruises and had asked what was happening. Nothing, I'd told her. Just clumsy. She'd had enough to deal with, working 50-hour weeks to keep our apartment, dealing with my dad who'd moved to Columbus with his new girlfriend and couldn't be bothered to send child support on time. I didn't want to add to her stress. But then Kyle had found out about my mom. In a town the size of Riverside, everyone knew everyone's business, and somehow Kyle had learned that my mom cleaned houses on weekends to make extra money. He'd started calling me maid's son and making jokes about my mom scrubbing toilets. The humiliation of that, of having my mother dragged into Kyle's cruel little game, had been worse than any physical attack. I'd tried reporting it once, in April, not to the principal, but to Mrs. Angela Donnelly, my English teacher, who'd seemed kind and approachable. I'd stayed after class one day and told her, in vague terms, that another student was making my life difficult. She'd listened sympathetically, asked who it was, and when I'd reluctantly said Kyle Thornton's name, her expression had changed. "Kyle? Are you sure? He's one of our best students. Star athlete. I find it hard to believe he'd do something like that without provocation." The implication had been clear. I must have done something to deserve it. I'd left her classroom feeling smaller than when I'd entered. That had been the moment I'd learned an important lesson. In Riverside, Kyle Thornton was untouchable. His father donated generously to the school's athletic programs. The Thornton name was on the scoreboard at the football field, on a plaque in the gymnasium, on the scholarship fund that sent one Riverside graduate to college every year. Teachers looked the other way. Administrators made excuses. Other students either joined in the bullying or stayed silent out of self-preservation. The worst incident had happened in late September, just 3 weeks before the meeting in Dr. Chambers' office. Kyle and 3 of his friends, Trevor Blackwood, Austin Sharp, and Connor West, all football players, all untouchable, had cornered me in the locker room after gym class. The bell had already rung, everyone else had cleared out, and I'd been trying to change clothes as quickly as possible when they'd surrounded me. "Hey, maid's son," Kyle had said, his voice echo-chambering off the tile walls. My dad's looking for a new cleaning lady. Think your mom would be interested? She any good on her knees?" The other guys had laughed. I'd tried to walk past them, but Trevor had shoved me back. That's when things had gotten physical in a way they never had before. Kyle had grabbed my shirt, twisted it in his fist, and slammed me against the lockers hard enough that I'd seen stars. "You think you're better than us because you read books? Because you get good grades? You're nothing. Your mom's nothing. You'll always be nothing in this town." Then he'd punched me. Not in the face where it would leave visible marks, but in the stomach, driving the air from my lungs. Trevor had hit me twice more while Austin and Connor had held my arms. When they'd finally let me go, I'd collapsed on the locker room floor, gasping for breath, my vision swimming. Kyle had stood over me, smiling. "Remember," he'd said, "you tell anyone about this, and it gets worse. Much worse. My dad owns half this town. Who do you think they're going to believe?" I'd managed to hide the bruises from my mom for a few days, but then she'd walked in on me changing shirts and seen the purple-black marks across my ribs and stomach. She'd demanded to know what happened, and I'd tried to lie, tried to say I'd fallen, but she'd looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Ethan, please, don't lie to me, not about this." So I'd told her everything. All 9 months of it, from the small harassments to the locker room attack. She'd listened with her hand over her mouth, getting paler with every detail, and when I'd finished, she'd pulled me into a hug so tight it hurt my bruised ribs. "We're going to the school tomorrow," she'd said. "We're going to the principal, and we're making them deal with this." I'd protested, told her it would only make things worse, but she'd been adamant. She'd already lost too much in the divorce, already felt powerless too many times. This was something she could fight. So that's how we'd ended up in Dr. Chambers' office on that Wednesday afternoon. My mom had called ahead, requesting an emergency meeting, and Dr. Chambers had agreed to see us at 3:30 p.m. What we hadn't known was that she'd also called in Kyle and his father. "I thought it would be productive to have all parties present," she'd explained when we'd walked in to find the Thorntons already seated, "so we can resolve this situation efficiently." My mom had laid out the facts calmly but firmly. The months of harassment, the escalating violence, the locker room attack. She'd shown Dr. Chambers photos she'd taken of my bruises, detailed notes she'd made of every incident I'd described, dates and times and witnesses. Dr. Chambers had listened, occasionally taking notes, her expression neutral. Richard Thornton had listened too, his face unreadable, while Kyle had sat there looking bored, occasionally checking his phone. When my mom had finished, Dr. Chambers had turned to Kyle. "Kyle, is what Ethan and his mother are describing accurate? Have you been involved in these incidents?" Kyle had shrugged, the picture of casual indifference. "I mean, we mess around sometimes, guys being guys, but I never hit him or anything. He's exaggerating. He has bruises," my mom had said sharply, her voice rising. "Documented injuries. Could have gotten those anywhere," Kyle had said, smiling slightly. "Maybe he's clumsy. Maybe he runs into things. How am I supposed to know?" That's when Richard Thornton had leaned forward, placing his large hands on the armrests of his chair like a king on a throne. "Dr. Chambers, with all due respect, I think we need to consider the source here. My son is a scholar athlete with a 3.7 GPA and a football scholarship to Ohio State already lined up. He's never been in trouble, never had any disciplinary issues. This young man," he gestured dismissively toward me, "transfers here from a private school, clearly struggling to fit in, and now he's making wild accusations against my son. It seems to me like someone's trying to blame their social difficulties on the most visible student in the school." Dr. Chambers had looked at me then, her expression thoughtful but troubled. "Ethan, I have to ask, why didn't you report any of this when it first started? If Kyle has been harassing you since January, why are we only hearing about it now in October?" I'd opened my mouth to answer, to try to explain the fear and the shame and the certainty that no one would believe me, but Richard Thornton had beaten me to it. He'd laughed, a deep, condescending sound that filled the small office. "Because my son runs this school," he'd said, not even trying to hide his contempt. "Because everyone knows the Thornton name means something in this community. Because this kid and his mother know that without proof, without witnesses, it's their word against ours. And in case you haven't noticed, Dr. Chambers, we fund half your programs here. The new weight room, Thornton Industries. The updated computer lab, Thornton Industries. That beautiful new scoreboard at the stadium, Thornton Industries. My family has been supporting this school for 3 generations. So yes, my son has influence here, as he should." The office had gone completely quiet. Even Kyle had looked slightly shocked by his father's bluntness. My mom's face had gone white, then red with anger. I'd felt my hands shaking, felt that familiar mix of rage and helplessness that I'd been carrying for 9 months. Dr. Chambers had set down her pen very carefully and removed her reading glasses. Then she'd stood up, walked around her desk, and done something that none of us had expected. She'd opened her office door and called out to her secretary. "Linda, could you please call Officer Dennis Murphy and ask him to come to the school immediately? Tell him it's regarding an assault case involving a student." Richard Thornton had stiffened. "Now wait just a minute." "No, Mr. Thornton," Dr. Chambers had said, her voice cold and clear. "You wait. You've just admitted, in front of witnesses, that your son has been using your financial influence over this school to operate with impunity. You've essentially confessed that there's a protection racket happening here, with your money as the currency. That ends today. She'd turned to Kyle. Kyle Thornton, you are hereby suspended from Riverside High School pending a full investigation into these allegations of assault and harassment. You are to leave campus immediately, and you are not to have any contact with Ethan Holloway or any potential witnesses. Violation of this directive will result in expulsion and criminal charges. Kyle's mouth had fallen open. You can't do that. I have practice tonight. We have a game Friday. You had practice, Doctor. Chambers had corrected. You had a game. Both of those privileges are now suspended. Your father can explain to you why. Richard Thornton had stood up, his face flushing red. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting to a teenager's complaints about normal school social dynamics. I won't stand for— Then sit down, Doctor, Chambers had said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife. Or leave. But if you leave, you'll be leaving without addressing the fact that your son has been systematically abusing another student for 9 months while you've been using your company's donations to ensure he faces no consequences. I've been principal here for 12 years, Mr. Thornton. I've dealt with bullying cases before, but I've never had a parent stand in my office and openly threaten me with withdrawal of funding if I hold their child accountable. That crosses a line. She'd walked back to her desk and pulled out a thick file folder. You're not the only one who keeps records. Mr. Thornton, I've been documenting concerns about Kyle for 2 years. Reports from other students about harassment that were never formally filed because the students were too afraid. Complaints from parents that stopped short of official action because they worked for Thornton Industries and feared retaliation. Observations from teachers who noticed Kyle's behavior but felt unable to report it due to pressure from the administration. She'd slid the folder across the desk. I've been waiting for someone to be brave enough to make a formal complaint. Ethan and his mother have given me that opportunity. So here's what's going to happen next. Officer Murphy will take statements from Ethan about the assault in the locker room. I will launch a formal investigation, speaking with the other students involved, Trevor Blackwood, Austin Sharp, and Connor West, I believe. I will review security camera footage from the hallways, which I'm quite certain will corroborate at least some of Ethan's accounts of harassment. And I will be recommending to the superintendent that this case be referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Richard Thornton had gone very still. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its confident edge. You're making a serious mistake. Thornton Industries has been a partner to this school for decades. My father built the original gymnasium. We've provided scholarships, equipment, funding, and I'm grateful for all of that, Doctor, Chambers had said. Truly. But generosity doesn't buy immunity from consequences. Your donations don't give your son the right to assault other students, and your financial support certainly doesn't give you the right to stand in my office and tell me that your son runs this school. This is an educational institution, Mr. Thornton, not a fiefdom. We operate under district policy, state law, and basic human decency, all of which Kyle has violated. There had been a knock on the door. Officer Dennis Murphy had arrived, a man in his mid-40s with 22 years on the Riverside Police Force, wearing his Navy uniform and a concerned expression. Dr. Chambers had explained the situation briefly, and Officer Murphy had asked to speak with me privately. My mom and I had been led to a conference room where Officer Murphy had taken my statement, asking detailed questions about the locker room assault, about the timeline of harassment, about witnesses and evidence. I'd told him everything, my voice shaking at first, but growing steadier as I spoke. He'd taken notes on an official incident report form, had photographed the fading bruises on my torso with my permission, and had assured me that he would be following up with the other students involved. When we'd returned to Dr. Chambers' office 40 minutes later, the Thorntons were gone. Doctor. Chambers had explained that Richard had left threatening legal action, insisting his son was innocent, and demanding that the suspension be lifted immediately. I told him the suspension stands, she'd said. I also told him that if he attempts to use his company's relationship with the school as leverage, I'll be filing a formal ethics complaint with the school board and potentially seeking a restraining order preventing Thornton Industries from any involvement in school affairs that could constitute a conflict of interest. She'd looked at me then, really looked at me, with an expression that held both sympathy and regret. Ethan, I want to apologize to you. This should never have been allowed to continue for 9 months. There were systems in place that should have protected you, and they failed. I failed. But I promise you, we're going to make this right. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation moved forward with surprising speed. Officer Murphy interviewed Trevor Blackwood, Austin Sharp, and Connor West separately. Under pressure and faced with potential assault charges, Trevor cracked first, admitting that the locker room attack had happened exactly as I'd described. Austin corroborated the story. Connor tried to deny it initially, but eventually admitted his involvement when confronted with the other statements. All 3 were suspended from school and the football team. Dr. Chambers reviewed security footage from the hallways and found multiple instances of Kyle shoving me, tripping me, or otherwise physically harassing me in ways that were clearly deliberate. She interviewed other students who, once they realized there would be actual consequences this time, came forward with their own stories of Kyle's bullying. A sophomore named Jeremy Walsh described being tormented by Kyle for an entire semester the previous year. A junior named Melissa Ford talked about being sexually harassed by Kyle until she'd transferred to a different school. The pattern was undeniable. The district attorney, a woman named Carol Brennan with 16 years of prosecuting experience, reviewed the evidence and decided to file charges. Kyle Thornton, Trevor Blackwood, Austin Sharp, and Connor West were all charged with assault and battery. Kyle faced additional charges of criminal harassment. Because they were all 17 at the time of the offenses, they would be tried as juveniles, but the charges were serious enough that they could result in detention time and permanent records. Richard Thornton hired a high-powered attorney, a man named Lawrence Kensington from Columbus, who specialized in defending wealthy clients. The strategy was predictable: attack my credibility, claim the whole thing was exaggerated, argue that it was just typical teenage roughhousing that I'd blown out of proportion because I couldn't fit in socially. But then something unexpected happened. The local newspaper, the Riverside Tribune, got wind of the story. A reporter named Thomas Yates, who'd been covering the school board beat for 8 years, started asking questions. How was it that Kyle Thornton had been allowed to operate with impunity for so long? Why had previous complaints been ignored? What role had Thornton Industries' donations played in shielding Kyle from consequences? His first article, published on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after the meeting in Dr. Chambers' office, was titled Money, Power, and Accountability: Inside the Thornton Bullying Case at Riverside High. It was devastating. Thomas had interviewed former students who'd been harassed by Kyle but had never filed formal complaints. He'd obtained internal school emails showing administrators discussing the Thornton situation and agreeing to handle it quietly to avoid complications with our donors. He'd found records of school board meetings where Richard Thornton had successfully lobbied for policies that gave him oversight of disciplinary decisions involving students whose parents worked for his company, essentially creating a conflict of interest that protected his son. The article went viral, at least by small-town Ohio standards. It was shared thousands of times on social media. Parents called for the resignation of school administrators who'd enabled the behavior. The superintendent, Dr. Raymond Foster, announced an independent investigation into the school's handling of bullying complaints. Richard Thornton's response was to threaten lawsuits against everyone: the school, the newspaper, Officer Murphy, even my mother. But the more he threatened, the worse he looked. His attorney, Lawrence Kensington, eventually advised him to back down and focus on defending Kyle against the criminal charges. The juvenile court hearing was scheduled for early December, 2 months after that pivotal meeting in Dr. Chambers' office. My mom and I sat in the courtroom as Judge Patricia Moreno, who'd been a juvenile court judge for 19 years, heard the evidence. The prosecutor presented the statements from Trevor, Austin, and Connor. They presented the security footage. They presented photos of my bruises and medical records from a doctor who'd examined me and documented injuries consistent with repeated physical assault. Kyle's attorney argued that I was a troubled kid who'd been struggling to fit in, that the incidents were exaggerated, that Kyle had just been engaging in normal teenage behavior. But when Judge Moreno asked Kyle directly if he'd attacked me in the locker room, Kyle made a crucial mistake. He doubled down on the lie, insisting nothing had happened, that I'd made it all up. Judge Moreno then called Trevor Blackwood to the stand. Trevor, who'd already given a statement to police and was facing his own charges, had nothing to gain by lying anymore. He told the truth, describing the attack in detail, admitting his role, and confirming that Kyle had been the ringleader. The contrast between Kyle's denials and Trevor's confession was damning. Judge Moreno found Kyle guilty of assault and battery and criminal harassment. She sentenced him to 6 months in juvenile detention, followed by 2 years of probation. She also ordered him to complete anger management counseling and to write a formal apology to me, though she noted that the apology would be for the court record and I was under no obligation to accept it or have any contact with Kyle. Trevor, Austin, and Connor received lighter sentences, 3 months detention each plus probation, because they'd cooperated with the investigation. The courtroom had been packed that day. My mom had held my hand through the entire proceeding. When the sentence was read, I'd felt something that I hadn't felt in almost a year: relief. Not happiness, not triumph, just the absence of the constant fear that had been my companion since January. Richard Thornton's reaction to his son's conviction was predictable. He pulled all funding from Riverside High School, withdrawing every donation, canceling every pledge, removing the Thornton name from every plaque and program. He thought it would hurt the school, would make them regret crossing him. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. The community rallied. Local businesses that had been quietly resentful of Thornton Industries' dominance stepped up with donations. Parents held fundraisers. Alumni contributed. Within 2 months, the school had replaced every dollar Richard Thornton had withdrawn, and they'd done it without strings attached, without conflicts of interest, without the implicit understanding that money bought immunity. But Richard wasn't done. He tried to destroy my mom's career, calling the dental office where she worked and suggesting to the owner, Dr. Kenneth Harper, that employing her was a liability now that our family had made ourselves enemies of Thornton Industries. Dr. Harper, to his eternal credit, had called my mom into his office, told her exactly what Richard had done, and then told her, "Your job is safe. Richard Thornton doesn't dictate who I employ. You're one of the best hygienists I've ever had, and you're staying." Richard also tried to blacklist my mom from her weekend house cleaning jobs, calling the families she worked for and pressuring them to fire her. Some did, intimidated by his influence, but others refused, and word spread about what he was doing. The backlash was swift. Thomas Yates wrote a follow-up article titled, "Retaliation: How Richard Thornton is Punishing a Whistleblower." It documented every attempt Richard had made to economically destroy my family, every threat he'd made, every pressure point he'd applied. The article painted him not as a wealthy philanthropist, but as a vindictive bully, which, it turned out, was exactly what he was. His company's reputation took a hit. Customers started taking their business elsewhere. Employees started quietly looking for other jobs. The town that had been under his thumb for so long was finally pushing back, and Richard Thornton was discovering that influence built on fear and money was fragile when people stopped being afraid. Kyle served his 6 months in juvenile detention and came out in June, just before what should have been his senior year. He'd lost his football scholarship to Ohio State. He'd lost his social status at Riverside High. Most of his friends had distanced themselves, not out of loyalty to me, but out of self-preservation. Being associated with Kyle Thornton was now a liability rather than an asset. He finished his senior year at a different school, a private academy 2 towns over where the Thornton name still carried some weight. I never saw him again after the court hearing. The school district's independent investigation concluded in January, 5 months after the initial meeting in Dr. Chambers' office. The report was scathing. It found that administrators had systematically ignored or minimized bullying complaints, particularly when they involved students from wealthy or influential families. It found that the school's acceptance of large donations from Thornton Industries had created conflicts of interest that compromised their ability to discipline Richard Thornton's son fairly. It recommended policy changes, mandatory training for all staff on handling bullying complaints, and the creation of an anonymous reporting system that would bypass building-level administrators and go directly to the district office. 3 administrators were placed on administrative leave, though none were ultimately fired. Dr. Chambers kept her job, in part because she'd ultimately done the right thing, but also because she'd been the one to blow the whistle on the systemic problems. She became something of a hero in the community, the principal who'd finally stood up to Richard Thornton. For me, the aftermath was complicated. I became known as the kid who took down Kyle Thornton, which brought its own form of unwanted attention. Some students treated me like a hero. Others resented me for disrupting the social order, for getting football players suspended, for causing the team to have a losing season without its quarterback and key defenders. I tried to keep my head down, focused on my grades, and got through the rest of junior year without incident. My mom and I grew closer through the ordeal. The shared trauma, the fight we'd fought together, had strengthened our bond. She stopped cleaning houses, not because Richard Thornton had succeeded in blacklisting her, but because Dr. Harper had given her a raise and more hours at the dental office, recognizing that she'd been through hell and deserved better. The raise was modest, but it was enough that she didn't need the weekend work anymore. She had her evenings and weekends back. We had dinners together. We watched movies. We slowly rebuilt some sense of normalcy. I also started seeing a therapist, Dr. Lisa Brennan, no relation to the district attorney, who specialized in trauma and adolescent psychology. She helped me process the 9 months of abuse, the fear and shame I'd carried, and the complicated feelings that came with finally getting justice. Vindication doesn't erase trauma, she told me in one of our early sessions. You can win in court and still carry the scars. That's normal. That's human. Senior year was better. I'd found a small group of friends, other students who were outsiders in various ways, and we stuck together. I threw myself into college applications, determined to get out of Riverside and never look back. I applied to schools across the country, and when the acceptance letters came in the spring, I chose a university in Oregon, as far from Ohio as I could get while still being in the continental United States. Graduation was in June, exactly 1 year after Kyle had been released from detention. The ceremony was held at the football stadium, under the scoreboard that no longer bore the Thornton name. It had been replaced with Riverside Community Memorial Scoreboard, funded by dozens of small donors rather than one wealthy family. I walked across the stage, received my diploma, and felt a sense of closure. Dr. Chambers shook my hand and said, "You should be proud of yourself, Ethan. You changed this school for the better." I'd nodded, not quite able to articulate what I was feeling. Pride, yes, but also exhaustion. Sadness for the year of my life that had been stolen by Kyle's cruelty, and a lingering anger that it had taken so long for anyone to help. That summer, before leaving for college, I ran into Thomas Yates at a coffee shop. He was working on his laptop, probably writing another article about local politics or school board drama. I'd approached his table and introduced myself, thanking him for the articles he'd written. "You helped people understand what was really happening," I'd said. "You made it harder for them to ignore." Thomas had smiled and closed his laptop. "I just reported the facts. You and your mom were the ones who had the courage to come forward. That's not easy, especially in a town like this where power structures are so entrenched. You did something brave." We'd talked for 20 minutes, and he'd told me something I hadn't known. The articles about the Thornton case had won him a state journalism award. More importantly, they'd inspired other students in other towns to come forward about their own bullying situations, armed with the knowledge that sometimes the system could be made to work if you were persistent and documented everything. You started something bigger than you realize, Thomas had said. This wasn't just about you and Kyle. It was about whether money and influence trump basic decency. The answer, at least this time, was no. I'd left that coffee shop feeling something I'd rarely felt in the past year. Hope. Not just for myself, but for the other kids who were going through what I'd gone through, fighting systems that seemed designed to protect their abusers. A year later, I was settled into college life in Oregon, 2,000 miles from Riverside. I'd made new friends, joined the debate team, and was thriving in classes that actually challenged me. I'd kept in touch with my mom through weekly phone calls, and she'd kept me updated on the fallout back home. Richard Thornton's business was struggling. Several major contracts had been lost when companies decided they didn't want to be associated with his reputation. He'd been forced to sell off parts of Thornton Industries, and the company that had once dominated the local economy was now just one employer among several. Kyle had enrolled at a small college in Indiana, nowhere near the prestige of Ohio State, and from what my mom heard through the town grapevine, he was keeping a low profile. Trevor, Austin, and Connor had all gone to community college, their plans for athletic scholarships and big universities derailed by their criminal records. Dr. Chambers was still principal at Riverside High, now working with a school board that took bullying seriously and had implemented all the recommended policy changes. The anonymous reporting system had already led to several successful interventions, catching problems early before they escalated the way mine had. One evening in October, exactly 2 years after that meeting in Dr. Chambers' office, I received an unexpected email. It was from Kyle Thornton. The subject line read, "I don't expect a response." My first instinct was to delete it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The email was brief. "Ethan, I know I don't have the right to contact you, and I know nothing I say can undo what I did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I've spent the past 2 years in therapy trying to understand why I became the person who hurt you. My therapist says I was modeling my father's behavior, using power and cruelty to control people because that's what I saw at home. That's not an excuse. It's just an explanation. I destroyed your junior year. I destroyed my own future. And I destroyed any chance we had at being decent human beings to each other. I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate, but it's all I have. I hope college is good for you. I hope you're happy. You deserved better than what I gave you. Kyle." I'd read that email 3 times, my emotions cycling between anger and something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. I'd never responded. I'd saved the email in a folder and moved on with my life. But the fact that he'd sent it at all meant something. It meant the system that had held him accountable had maybe, possibly, started to teach him that actions have consequences, that you can't buy or bully your way out of being a decent person. 3 years after the meeting in Dr. Chambers' office, I was home for Thanksgiving. My mom had moved to a better apartment, her career was stable, and she'd even started dating someone, a kind man named George, who worked as an electrician and treated her with the respect she deserved. We were having coffee at the same shop where I'd talked to Thomas Yates years earlier when Dr. Chambers walked in. She saw us, smiled, and came over to our table. "Ethan," she said warmly, "I heard you're doing well at school. Debate team captain, if the alumni newsletter is accurate." I'd confirmed it, and she'd beamed. "I'm not surprised. You always had the ability to articulate truth, even when it was difficult." We'd chatted for a few minutes, and before she left, she'd said something that stayed with me. "You know, that day in my office when Richard Thornton told me his son ran the school, that was the day I realized I'd failed in my job. Not just to you, but to every student who'd been made to feel powerless. I'd let the culture become toxic because I was afraid of losing funding, afraid of confronting powerful people. Your courage reminded me what courage looks like. Thank you for that." Sitting here now, 7 years after that meeting, I'm 24 years old with a master's degree in social work. I work for a nonprofit that helps schools develop anti-bullying programs and supports students who are going through what I went through. I've talked to hundreds of kids who felt powerless, who thought the system would never protect them, who believed that people like Kyle Thornton always win because their parents have money and influence. And I tell them the same thing every time. Document everything, tell someone who will listen, and don't give up. Because sometimes, if you're persistent enough and brave enough, you find that one person, a principal, a police officer, a reporter, who decides that basic human decency matters more than money or influence or keeping the peace. Sometimes the system works. Not always. Not easily. But sometimes. My mom still lives in Riverside, but I don't plan to move back. That town will always carry shadows for me. Memories of hallways where I felt hunted, locker rooms where I was cornered, and the year of my life that was stolen by Kyle Thornton's cruelty. But it also carries the memory of fighting back and winning, of a principal who chose justice over donations, of a police officer who took a teenager's complaint seriously, of a reporter who decided the story mattered, of a mother who refused to let her son be invisible. Richard Thornton still lives in Riverside too, though Thornton Industries is a fraction of what it used to be. I heard he divorced his wife 3 years ago, that the stress of the scandal and the business decline had destroyed their marriage. He's a smaller man now, in every sense. His power came from fear and money, and when people stopped being afraid and his money dried up, there was nothing left. Kyle, from what I've heard, is working in Indianapolis as a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company. He's not on social media, keeps a low profile, and by all accounts is trying to build a life away from the wreckage of his past. I hope he's learned from what happened. I hope he's genuinely changed. But that's his journey, not mine. The last time I was in Dr. Chambers' office was 2 years ago, when I came back to Riverside to give a talk to students about bullying and recovery. The office looked the same. Same desk, same chairs, same clock on the wall. But the atmosphere was different. There were posters on the walls about the new anonymous reporting system, about students' rights, about resources for anyone experiencing harassment. Dr. Chambers had told me that bullying reports had increased by 300% since the new policies were implemented. Not because bullying had gotten worse, but because students finally believed they would be taken seriously. "You did that," she'd said. "You showed them that speaking up matters." I think about that Wednesday afternoon in October 7 years ago more often than I'd like to admit. The fear I felt walking into that office, not knowing if anyone would believe me. The moment when Richard Thornton had laughed and said his son ran the school, thinking his money made him invincible. And then the moment when Dr. Chambers had stood up, called the police, and refused to be intimidated. That was the moment I learned that power isn't permanent, that systems can be challenged, that sometimes when you speak truth to power, power blinks first. Kyle Thornton thought he ran that school. His father thought money could buy immunity from consequences. They were both wrong. And that wrongness, that spectacular failure of their arrogance, changed not just my life, but the entire culture of Riverside High School. Students there now know that they matter more than donations, that their safety matters more than football games, that adults in authority will choose justice over convenience, at least sometimes, if you give them the chance. The scars from those 9 months of bullying haven't disappeared. I still tense up in crowded hallways. I still have moments where I remember the feeling of being cornered, helpless, certain no one would help. But I also remember fighting back and winning, not through violence or revenge, but through documentation, persistence, and finding allies in a system I'd been taught to distrust. That's the story I tell the kids I work with now. Not that the system always works. It doesn't. Not that justice is guaranteed. It isn't. But that fighting is worth it. That speaking up matters. That sometimes, when the bully's father stands in the principal's office and says his son runs the school, the principal does something nobody expects. She proves him wrong. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.